Listen, if you haven't had the chance to watch last episode's cut content yet, then I highly recommend you do before watching this video. There's some extremely important context explaining Roxy's actions and Rudy's grief. Details I'm thoroughly shocked the anime didn't include, and I would honestly go so far as to say are essential. The finale was a lot more faithful when it came to adapting the rest, but without that missing context, it makes everything just seem flat. So, whether you watch or not is up to you, but I would say last episode was just as important as this one. Now, as for what you missed here, for the most part, it was just a lot of nuance. Slight changes that make some scenes a little bit different. I'm talking things like Sylphie shutting down Norn and Alina Lise being the best wingwoman. So, as I go through what the anime left out from Season 2 one last time, I hope, as always, you enjoy learning more about it. It's been my absolute pleasure to make these types of videos for you. Now, I do need to do one last reminder to check out the Mushoku Tensei inspired Mugen apparel because after this week it's gonna be gone forever. That's the Goddess Tees, the New Beginning set, and the stickers. We'll be archiving that collection probably on Sunday. The link to that will be down below, and for those who already bought, we honestly can't thank you enough. We promise the quality is something you'll be happy with and can't wait to see your reactions when you finally get them. But anyway, episode 48, Succession, covering chapters 13 to 16 from volume 12 of the light novel. Whereas the anime starts right with Rudy's arrival, the journey getting here had actually taken him 10 days. It was ample time for Rudy to consider the promise he'd just committed to, as well as contemplate the experience he was now returning from. Part of this included informing Lilia about his decision, which to her wasn't surprising at all. She readily accepted it without any judgment whatsoever. This was because monogamous marriage only existed in Millis, so convincing her wasn't going to be a problem. No, what was trying to explain things to Norn. Of course, Sylphie was the most important, but if anyone was gonna put up a fuss right from the get-go, Rudy knew Norn would react the worst. It was one of the problems he knew he couldn't run away from, despite knowing how angry she'd get. Because of his renewed conviction to continue forward, facing Norn was something he simply had to do. It was all part of living with no regrets again. It was once that word had popped into his mind that's when Rudy would contemplate the man-god's words again. A foreboding message he believed hadn't come to fruition yet, since what he felt now wasn't regret but instead sadness. Anxiety then bubbled for the remaining days he was traveling, so by the time he had made it back to the city, he was just about ready to burst from the anticipation of it all. It's the reason he started to sprint and leave everyone behind. Now, the anime had added quite a bit of drama to this because, for one, Rudy didn't fall flat on his face, and for another, Aisha was right there as soon as he entered. There wasn't that build-up making you think perhaps something did happen. There was a moment where Rudy was about to fall though, but because Alina Lise's a real one through and through, she was right there next to him to catch him. She had run alongside Rudy all the way to the house, then provided much needed composure to someone who was clearly panicking. It's not too important since it doesn't really change anything, but it does show a part of Alina Lise I've actually grown quite fond of. As for Rudy's misplaced regrets, it turns out they were just referring to the deaths of Paul and his old parents. The rest of his anxiety was thankfully unnecessary. Now, it was once home that Rudy would get the chance to talk to Sylphie first, since in the time it took for Aisha to get Norn from school, the two were able to catch up privately. It was a conversation which basically gave us a small update on what happened here. There wasn't anything particularly noteworthy, but there was this one incident at school that Nanahoshi took care of. A rather peculiar development since she usually kept to herself. Aside from that, Aisha's hobby of gardening was flourishing, Norn somehow became something like an idol and now has her own fan club, Zaniba, Cliff, Linnea, and Persenna all made their occasional checkups, Ariel was upset that Rudy didn't even tell her he was leaving, then Bodygotti was still missing and unaccounted for. It was fairly standard stuff for the 4 months he'd been away from everyone. Sylphie would then ask what happened to Rudy, but after seeing everyone's faces and the absence of Paul, it didn't take long for her to come to her own conclusions. Greeting Zenith only reaffirmed her assumption, and it made clear the ensuing conversation wasn't going to be as happy as she thought it was. What she initially perceived as Zenith simply disapproving of their marriage was instead shown to be something worse. Now, Norn and Aisha's return was first prefaced by a round of tea, which, as you'd expect, was heavily scrutinized by Lilia. Since this was what she trained Aisha to do, it was only natural she was judging to see whether her daughter was capable or not. This included gathering the luggage, hanging people's coats, and drying their shoes, all of which was done impeccably and to Lilia's satisfaction. It was decent work that only warranted a light reminder of why it is Aisha does all this. This was a comment Rudy found to be a little bit weird, since considering both hadn't seen each other in years, you'd think they'd act a little more warm to each other. Instead, Lilia was more in teacher mode, so perhaps this was just her showing restraint. They were about to have quite the serious conversation after all. The conversation itself wasn't particularly different, but both Rudy and Norn were a lot more blunt with what they said to each other. Rudy just straight up stated that Paul had died, and Norn rebutted by confirming Rudy couldn't save either of their parents. Of course, she was angry and upset, but she wasn't so immature as to not hear what Rudy had to say first. So, after a summary of the tragedy and a waterfall of tears, Norn would quickly accept that this was just the outcome, then immediately look forward in a way that Rudy could only be envious of. Whereas he confined himself and required saving, not only did Norn face Paul's death head-on, but she did so instantly and all by herself. She didn't blame Rudy or the world or herself, but instead accepted that this was how things were and continued forward. That's not to say she wasn't feeling grief, but she certainly wasn't feeling that same level of regret like how Rudy did. No, Norn understood that nothing could be done about it, and in the process displayed yet another incredible feat of emotional maturity. To Rudy, she was truly strong in her own way. This was further exemplified when she alone understood the feelings Aisha was holding back, since what Rudy mistook for Aisha trying to be distant from Lilia, Norn recognized as Aisha showing restraint. One glance was all it took for Norn to understand Aisha's true emotions here. Now, we saw Norn take Paul's longsword after this, but what we didn't see was how Aisha took his other one. This ultimately left Rudy with nothing, since while he was supposed to get Paul's armor, Zenith subconsciously took that for herself. It was an outcome Rudy was surprisingly okay with, since to him, Paul had given him so much already. Rudy would then go on to explain Zenith's condition, which was just as much a mystery now as it was before. He wasn't certain nothing could be done about it, but with the way everyone else spoke, they all made it seem like chances of recovery were slim. Like, if healing magic wasn't good enough and the current medical technology too primitive to examine her brain, any sort of recovery just seemed unrealistic right now. Perhaps inflicting the same level of shock would have her memories snap back, but that wasn't something Rudy was willing to experiment. Besides, Rudy wasn't even sure she'd be happy if she got her memories back anyway. He knew it wasn't right to assume that though, so at the very least they had to try and do something, the minimum of which was to find some proper care and treatment for her. It was after this that everyone would say their goodbyes, and through that, give a little insight as to what some were gonna do next. Geese and Tallhand were planning to return to adventuring, while Viera and Shiera were gonna go back to Asura. Apparently there were still people from the search and rescue squad they were indebted to, so that's who they were gonna go help out next. This reminded Rudy that Zenith's family had actually been financing Paul's activities, so if anything he at least needed to send them a letter. Sure, Zenith wasn't in the best condition, but they did deserve to know that she'd been found. Fast forward now to when only 5 were left, and aside from the egregious act of removing Dillo as their new household pet, the true carnage, so to say, was in Rudy's plea to Sylphie. As he recounted the extent of his betrayal, the longer it went on, the worse it got. Especially when he mentioned how he may have gotten Roxy pregnant. This brought up the whole notion of how he had to take responsibility, but was in actuality nothing but a lie. For those of you currently confused, last episode I mentioned how Alina Lise told Rudy that Roxy was pregnant. This was what spurred Rudy's rapid change of heart, and it made it easier to accept the idea of having 2 wives. Well, we don't find this out until a little bit after this fight, but that whole thing was just a story Alina Lise made up. She never had that type of conversation with Roxy, and Roxy never told her anything indicating that she was pregnant. As it turns out, Alina Lise just couldn't stand seeing Roxy be so sad, so she baited Rudy into thinking that he had to take care of her. It was a simple trap that worked exactly how she intended it to. a little white lie that simply sped up what was likely inevitable. So, Roxy isn't pregnant and she never was, but the notion she was a major part in things turning out this way. But anyway, it was Norn's outburst after that became quite the point of contention. We all saw just how obnoxious she was being, and to Rudy it was starting to become unacceptable. So much so that he almost got to the point of hitting her. He knew he wasn't in the right to do so, but if it meant putting a stop to this heinous Roxy slander, Rudy was just about ready to do so. Even if it meant making his sister hate him, if it prevented Roxy from leaving, then that was a sacrifice he was willing to make in that moment. Luckily, it didn't come to that, but that was the level of panic Rudy was dealing with when confronted with Roxy leaving like that. He was so desperate to make things right that he would do literally anything. That's when Sylphie would step up and set her straight instead, and the way she did was a lot more firm than the soft, kind words we saw her say in the anime. Whereas here she was being all nice and considerate, in the novel Sylphie straight up told Norn to stop. She had even scolded Norn for being too harsh. It was a more stern version of Sylphie I would have loved to see in the anime. This brings us now to why Sylphie was so understanding of everything, and in addition to all we saw her say already, there was an interesting caveat she mentioned for the scenario when Rudy did sleep with someone else. Sylphie knew that when he inevitably did, he would also be loyal enough to want to bring her into the family. Not once did Sylphie think she'd have Rudy to herself forever. The reason she was so surprised when the topic came up then was because she never expected it to happen during this trip here. She always figured it would be Linnea, Persena, or Nanahoshi, but completely forgot it could happen while away saving his parents. She was then so caught up in the tragedy that had befallen Rudy that it didn't even occur to her that he could have hooked up with someone. That's the reason why she was so visibly surprised when Rudy revealed it to her. It wasn't because he had brought another wife home, but rather because of the wild circumstances under which it happened. Only after thinking about it a little bit longer did Sylphie realize, yeah, this makes sense for Rudy. So, that's when the two would accept each other as equals and both agree to support Rudy together. Now, it's a bit later we find out Sylphie went into this conversation expecting the worst, so that was yet another reason for why she was so surprised by it. What she initially thought was Rudy getting ready to leave her was instead something far more manageable. Rudy, of course, wasn't ever gonna do that, but for some reason Sylphie had a feeling Rudy wasn't coming back to her. Consider it a very strong sense of foreboding. Sylphie, Roxy, and Rudy would then get the chance to talk in private, the majority of which was spent discussing how things would work from now on. They had decided Sylphie would get Rudy until she gave birth, and after that the two would split their time with him equally. This was an idea that came directly from Sylphie, since to monopolize Rudy wouldn't be fair to Roxy. There was also no telling when Rudy might come home with a third wife. Of course, Rudy had zero intention of doing so, but in the off chance he did, Sylphie knew her and Roxy needed to spend as much time as possible with him now. It was a notion Rudy fully exclaimed to be impossible so long as he wasn't depressed and confronted by a woman of Roxy's caliber again. As long as that specific situation never happened again, Rudy was convinced he wouldn't cheat ever. Well, for a second time. Fast forward to a scene where Dillo tried to hop in bed with Rudy and Sylphie, then after that would be the days following this. Their relationship was going stronger than ever, and Rudy had no problem loving both her and Roxy equally. He figured as long as he kept doing what he was doing, then maybe he could get by even with a third wife. Roxy now spent her days as a professor at the university, and it wasn't long before she'd been introduced to everyone. 1 month later was Sylphie's delivery, and aside from this being the third that Rudy has been a part of, there was a scene right after where Rudy would ask Roxy to do the same for him. He had essentially just witnessed the birth of his first child, then immediately went to Roxy and told her she was next. Some may consider this hopeless behavior, but to Rudy he was genuinely looking forward to it. It was all part of his resolve to living life to the fullest. Now, the part with Paul's grave just reaffirmed what it was he was living for, and it captured that message pretty much perfectly, much to the point that there's nothing for me to really add here. It was the anime simply reminding us what this story is all about, the portrayal of Rudy's continued journey forward. So that's that for Mushoku Tensei Season 2. For those of you that only watch my channel for this anime, I guess I'll see you back here when Season 3 comes out. If not, then you can always check out my videos on Tensura too. That's the anime I'll be talking about till ReZero in October. But yeah, thanks again for watching my coverage of this, and if you want to support the channel then consider leaving a like and subscribing. If you're feeling generous then you can also go and check out the Mugen apparel. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content then you already know what to do. So until next time, ciao!